Hello, hello. Hello, everyone, and welcome to Politics and Prose bookstore. My name's Grant. I'm a bookseller here, where we host in-person events, trips, and classes. Before we get started today, I would like to remind everyone to please silence their cell phones as to not to disrupt the event. When it gets time for the Q&A, we have a mic set up by the right pillar. Please speak clearly into the mic so everyone can hear your question. We strongly encourage masks at today's event. Ramsey, our wonderful events staffer, will be passing them around. After the event, there will be a sign-in. We encourage you to buy the books up at the checkout. Today, I'm excited to welcome Tiffany Yu with her new book, The Anti-Ableist Manifesto. The Anti-Ableist Manifesto frames context for conversations, breaks down the language of ableism, identifies microaggressions, and offers actions that lead to authentic allyship. Tiffany Yu is an award-winning social impact entrepreneur, disability advocate, and content creator. She is the founder and CEO of Diversability, a social enterprise to elevate disability pride and build disability power. Yu is the co-founder of the Awesome Foundation Disability Chapter, serves on the LA 20 Olympic and Paralympic Games Working Group, and was a co-chair of the World Economic Forum Sustainable Development Impact Summit. Tiffany will be in conversation with Mia Ives Rubley, a policy analyst, community organizer, international speaker, and passionate advocate. She currently works as the director of the Disability Justice Initiative at the Center for American Progress and is one of the commissioners on the President's Advisory Committee on Asian Americans, Native Hawaiians, and Pacific Islanders. Please give the warmest welcome to Tiffany Yu and Mia Ives Rubley.
Good evening, everybody. I hope you are doing well and getting prepared for big holiday feasts coming up. Again, my name is Mia Ives Rubley. Tiffany and I have known each other how long? Oh my gosh, it's been maybe 20.
I do have a funny story from the first time that I met Mia. It must have been 2018 or 2019. And I was living in San Francisco at the time. And Mia was speaking at an event. And at the end of the event, or at the beginning of the event, I said hi to Mia, and then I ran away.
She literally, I was like, oh, I'm going to have a great conversation with her because we've talked on Twitter. And then she disappeared on me.
Yes, and I still do that. I'm, relatable content. And then I ran into Mia maybe in 2022 here in DC, and I said, hey, remember that time that I saw you speak at an event and then I ran away? And then she goes, yeah, I remember.
I remember it quite clearly.
I also just want to do a logistical thing. If there are people who want to sit, there are a couple seats up here. If you want to stand and take photos from the side. If you have an open seat next to you, can you raise your hand? But yeah, we were internet friends before we met in person.
Yeah, as the disability community often is. I would love to talk to you, again, the book was amazing, and got to read it from, cover to cover. And I was wondering, we've seen a lot more books coming out on disability, which is great. What inspired you to write this book?
So originally I used to joke that the answer was contractual obligations, but people didn't find that funny. But the genesis of this book kind of came from looking at my own work experiences of working at places like Goldman and Bloomberg. And as someone, so one of my arms is paralyzed, as someone who has both apparent and non-apparent disabilities, I kind of looked at the data and said, why is it that our unemployment numbers are still twice that of our non-disabled peers, and why do I feel like this exception all the time? And so my hope is that this book leaves readers feeling energized and hopeful that we can not only close the disability employment gap, but build a world where all of us feel like we are whole and worthy and valuable simply because we exist. And this book can't be everything to everyone, right? So like you said, there are a lot of books coming out about disability by disabled authors right now. And I feel like we're on the cusp of a cultural shift around disability, I hope.
Yeah, I really do hope that. It's been interesting because when I was growing up, I never had this type of book out there and never really felt very represented in the media. No books, no guides. I was wondering, when I was reading, I read a quote that you pulled out from Keely Cat Wells that says, to utilize the question, what is your story, rather than what happened to you, because oftentimes we get these random questions from strangers about sort of why we are disabled. And you reflected that Dr. Brene Brown stated, our stories aren't meant for everyone, and not everyone has earned the right to them. Can you talk about when you decided to include disability into your story and how you decided to tell it? Has your strategy changed at all?
Ooh, such a good question. So I became disabled on November 29th, 1997, which if you're looking at the dates, the anniversary will actually be this Friday. And I didn't tell anyone about it for 12 years. And I have some friends that I grew up with here and some friends from college here, where up until I was a senior in college, I really didn't have ownership over my disability story. Mia, exactly like you said, like when we're not represented, when we don't see ourselves on screen, behind the screen, we don't see our names on book covers, it makes us feel like we are devalued, we're not important, our stories don't matter. And so I had internalized for a long time that my story didn't matter. And so I didn't tell anyone about it publicly until I was a senior in college. And at that particular point in time, so I got into a car accident. My dad passed away. I permanently paralyzed one of my arms. And up until that point, I didn't tell anyone the details of the car accident or that I was in one. People assumed that my arm injury was from birth. And then I told everyone that my dad was away on a trip. And I used the phrase collective gaslighting in the book. And when my editor looked at it, she goes, "This is too complicated of a term." And I was like, but that's what it felt like I was doing. It was hard for me to keep track of all of the lies. And there's a lot of, and we'll touch on this a little bit later in our conversation, but there's some cultural context here as well, where as the daughter of Asian immigrants, it was instilled in me not to share anything that might be seen as shameful. And disability, a death in the family, now having an apparent disability were all seen as these shameful things that you don't want to tell anyone about for fear that the whole household, the whole family is seen as shameful. So that date was October 22nd, 2009. I still remember the day. I was invited to speak on a panel at Georgetown, which is where I went to school, Hoya Saxa. I shared the story of the car accident publicly for the first time, and I cried. And I cried because I think it was the first time I felt seen in my truth. And I cried also because there was so much unresolved pain that I had internalized. There's this other book I love called The Body Keeps the Score around, and many of you, okay, we're all book friends together. But that trauma was, I didn't have any release for it anywhere. So fast forward, what was that? That was 2009. Fast forward 15 years. You can go online and watch a 10-minute version where I talk about the car accident and the things that I've learned from it. But you also have a one-sentence version where, I still get pretty much on a daily basis, because I wear a wrist splint on my injured arm. People ask, what happened to your hand? Oh, and Eric Garcia is here. There are a couple people who are actually featured in the book who are here. If you want to raise your hand. We have Eric. We have Dr. Amy Kenny. Yeah, clap. And I get distracted easily. And Diego Mariscal is here. Sorry, can I just do one plug for Diego? Yesterday just announced his organization received a $1 million grant to invest in disabled entrepreneurs. And so, I I bring that up because we're all doing the thing and trying to shine bright in community together. But I digress. And so pretty much on an almost daily basis, I'll get a "what happened to your hand?" And I say, "Got into a car accident a long time ago. My arm's paralyzed. It doesn't hurt." And the reason why I have a 10-minute version and I have a 1-sentence version is the 1-sentence version, there's no value judgment. I just say, here's the thing. I might have some access needs. You might need to help me carry things. Signing books has been interesting now as a left-handed person, trying, as the book, trying to hold the book open, but I figured that part out. And I also learned that we figured things out. So that's been the evolution of my story.
So interesting. I think what I reflected from the book, and I think we often say this in the disability community, is we all come at disability from different angles. We all have different, as you said, disability origin stories, right? And I think what's interesting about you and me is that we both share that we're Asian American and we're disabled, which is even rarer. There's not a lot of us, and most of us know each other. At least those that are out in public right now, doing advocacy work. And I think about the fact that I sort of recognized my disability before I recognized that I was an Asian American, and that was partially because I was adopted, and you sort of went the opposite track where you recognized you were Asian American because you had Asian American parents and then became disabled. I was wondering, why do you think it's important for folks to know that disabled people relate to their disability in different ways and at different times?
Ooh, that's such a good question. So I know you touched briefly on disability origin stories, and oftentimes when I give talks, I talk about how some of us within the disability community have 2 origin stories. The first is, at least for mine, my first disability origin story is this story of the car accident. But my second disability origin story is that turning point, or that period of time, or that October 22nd, 2009 date where I decide to take ownership of my story. And I decide to take pride in my disability identity. And I want to share that not all disabled people will have a second disability origin story. There are some disabled people who may never claim a disability identity, even if that is the thing that they have. And that's okay, right? How can we make sure we're meeting people where they are? But the other thing I wanted to share about kind of our entryway into our own disability stories is I didn't identify as Asian American or Taiwanese American until I was 18. I grew up in Bethesda, Maryland. Is anyone here from Bethesda? Woo! Oh, look, we got some Bethesda people. And at the time when I was growing up, there weren't that many Asian families. And again, as the daughter of Asian immigrants, I had internalized that my pathway to success was assimilation or erasure of my race. And so if people would tell me like, "Oh, you're Asian," I'd be like, "No, I'm American." But I'm both. We can hold both. And so it wasn't until I got to college that I finally, for the first time, I met another Taiwanese American student, and I said to her, her name's Jackie, I said, "Jackie, we should start a club." And then we did. And I actually had someone tell me the other day, she goes, a lot of times for those of us who are in the disability community, or maybe we share very proudly other identities we have, so many other people view them as this politicized thing. But really what we're trying to do is we're trying to find each other and know that we're not alone. And so it's not like, hey, I'm trying to, assert all of these aspects of my identity to make a point in some way. It's more, how can I not feel so alone in this experience and find my people?
Great. I am going to put you on the spot and have you read a little bit. And this is on sort of why we should care about disability. I think it's important for folks to understand why it's so important that disability is out in the public sphere.
And I also wanted to share, so I asked Mia to do this, and at every single book stop I've had, I've invited a local disability advocate or someone local, and Mia sent me these passages she wanted to read, and then I saw her book and it had all these sticky notes in it. I said, "Oh, you actually read the book?" She goes, "Of course." And so people have varying levels of of how much they will consume the content before. Do you just want me to read this highlighted part?
Just down to the next page. Yep. Or
This?
down. Yeah. Through the
Here?
yeah. So it starts with a bracket. Do you see the bracket?
The blue highlight?
Yeah.
Okay.
There's a bracket on the side.
Okay. What should you do then when you observe microaggressions happening around you? How can you interrupt them with a call-in, if appropriate, to keep people accountable? Before we start, a quick caveat. Some disabled people may choose not to do this, interrupting, since we've had to deal with microaggressions our whole lives. And we may not have the resources, energy, or desire to educate others, and that's okay. The following list targets non-disabled people, though disabled people can still use it if they choose, of course. While disabled people are at the forefront of disability advocacy, non-disabled allies should also take ownership of interrupting ableist microaggressions so that they can support us and lift some of the burden from our shoulders. An interruption from a non-disabled person can also help hold up a mirror to the behaviors and words of other non-disabled people, an effective way to call them in and create behavioral change. I like to use this story from Brian Anderson, co-founder of Fathering Together, even though it talks about homophobia and his reflection on his role as an LGBTQIA+ ally, because I think it can be applied to ableism. And here's the quote from him. "I'm a cisgendered white man who is heterosexual who has a Christian background," Anderson starts in a LinkedIn video. Many years ago, Anderson was part of a multicultural education class that was tasked with a role-playing activity to talk about LGBTQIA+ issues. And a heterosexual man in the group chose to wear a dress to represent being gay. Afterward, one of Anderson's gay friends approached him separately and said, "I know that you're friends with him, so I need you to talk with him about how that wasn't cool." At first, Anderson didn't understand why his gay friend couldn't just talk to the perpetrator himself. The friend explained, "This is where you become an ally. This is where I need you to talk to him because he'll hear you before he'll hear me." Anderson's friend was implying that the perpetrator would respond better to a request to stop the harm if another heterosexual person instead of a gay person called him out. Often, harm is most effectively prevented when perpetrators are interrupted by people who look like them and who benefit from similar privileges.
I gave you the wrong one to read, but that is okay. We will sidetrack and go back to the one that I'm supposed to have you read. But I think one of the things that I thought was really interesting in that passage in particular is talking about allyship and what it should look like. So can you give me an example of what you think allyship looks like?
Ooh. Was that part of the prepared questions?
It was.
Why don't I share an example that didn't make it in the book? So I was at a dinner a couple of years ago, and I have been to a lot of these dinners, and seated dinners are very anxiety-inducing for me because how do I break the bread off of the loaf of bread when it's being passed around? How do I put butter on my bread? How do I cut the steak when the main entrees come out? And so I end up not eating pretty much at those scenarios. And if you read the book, you'll also learn that I started my career at Goldman, and there were a lot of client dinners that I also had to subject myself to. So the dish comes out. Hello. So the dish comes out, and the person sitting next to me is kind of facilitating a conversation at the dinner. And he had a level of situational awareness where we kind of made a little bit of eye contact. I nodded, and then he is still facilitating the meal. And he pulls my plate over to his while he's still facilitating this conversation, and he starts cutting my dish. And then he pushes it back over to me. He's still, there was no interruption, no big thing or anything. He pushes it back over to me. I eat my steak or whatever it is at the time. And that's it. And that person just so happened to be will.i.am. But I think about that and the level of, I call it like situational awareness in that perspective, where I have a quote in the book where I talk about how negotiating our access just becomes so exhausting all the time. And I shared a similar example in the book where I received two types of comments. One type of comment was from well-meaning people who said, well, you should have just asked for help. And then the other type of comment were other disabled people who said, oh, this is why I just go back to my hotel room when it's time for the meal so that I don't have to figure out how to navigate this environment or have people look at me in a certain way, or, because the way I'm eating may look different from how you're doing it. So that's my example. How would you define it? Mia's like a local hero. This is why I said hi to her and then I ran away. Yeah. What does allyship look like for you?
Yeah. Well, I actually want to read a quote, and I think that will actually help you understand what I think was really great that you talked about in the book, which was from Jennifer Chasman Brown, an educator and DEIA consultant, that said she had an agreement with a friend that they could interrupt and address ableist behavior. I have similar friends who do the same. They check in to see if it's okay to step in. I think that it's not about you, the person that is supposed to be the ally, being the hero, which I think a lot of times people feel like that's their modality, is that they're supposed to be the strong person in the relationship that's supposed to fix everything. And I think what I see more as allyship and more actually as comradeship is the fact that you're in this fight with me. And I believe there's a quote in here from a famous person. Do you remember it? That talks about, yeah.
Is it how like all our liberation is tied together?
No, it wasn't that one.
There are a lot of quotes. There are a lot of quotes in the book.
But it's talking about you are united in this fight with me. So it's not that I need your help. It's that I need to know that you're in this fight with me. And I know there's a quote in there, and you should read it, and then you'll find that quote. So
can I add one other thing to that?
Yeah.
I kind of think about, so this essentially is my hometown book event. I grew up in Bethesda. I went to school in DC. Wow, so much clapping. Thank you. And I bring that up because there are people here that I grew up with who went to Whitman High School with me. There are people who went to Georgetown. There are people here who are part of the disability community. Is that you, Melanie? Okay, no, I'm so sorry. I just, but I bring that up because I actually think part of where my best allies have come from is because they've gotten to know me and they've become my friends, and we've known each other for 20 years or 15 years or half of our lives, or I've been at your wedding, and you show up here because you care about me, and because I care about this, then you care about this too. I don't know how that's scalable. I mean, I did live in San Francisco for a period of time, and I haven't figured that out, but I do really believe in intimacy and how that can create some really incredible allies.
Most definitely. I think about also the fact that, Jennifer Chasman Brown talks about how her friends ask for permission. And I think that's huge, particularly in the disability community, where a lot of times people don't ask permission to touch us, to help us. We go to the hospital, particularly if you've grown up with a disability. Doctors move you around and you don't actually even learn about boundaries when you're growing up. So I was wondering, why do you think it's important for non-disabled people to check in before assisting you?
Yeah. I mean, how wonderful is a consent-based culture? right? Can we get some applause? You applause everything else. But I just think about the violations of our space. And, my injury happened when I was 9. And I think about how I didn't really feel like I had agency over my own body until I was in my 30s. I even think about some micro moments that have happened since arriving here where, someone said, hey, is it okay if I pet your dog? And you said, no, he's working. But thanks for asking, and I wonder how many times people have just inserted themselves into touching your dog or touching your chair without your consent. So yeah, I share this other example in the book where I boarded a train and I had to put my luggage, the luggage storage area compartment was underneath the chairs. And so I went to turn my luggage over and this guy shoved me to the side and shoved my luggage under the chairs, under the seats. And then he turned to me and he goes, you should really ask for help. And I was shocked in that moment. I was like, I don't want to engage with this situation. But I think about the number of times where the things I do will look different because I've learned how to do two-armed things with one arm. And so give us that space. And I include, I really like the phrase, I'm here if you need any support, or I'm here if you need any assistance. Because I also think about the number of us who have more apparent disabilities who get offered help on way too much that it ends up becoming a microaggression. But at the same time, let me know if you need any assistance or let me know if you need any support. I don't even have to engage with you. And it's proactive enough. And at the same time, if that disabled person does come to you and they say, hey, I could actually use some assistance, then you follow up with, let me know specifically how I can help. Because we may have specific ways that you can help support us.
Yeah, and I think it's really important to note also that sometimes helping without asking can actually put the person in danger. And I definitely have had a couple of situations where folks have tried to help me without asking and put me at risk of falling out of my chair. So I definitely want to emphasize the importance of asking permission before
And you
helping.
can answer any of these questions too. I think, or you can ask Mia later.
No, yeah. So I'm going to go back to why it's important to talk about disability and why you should care about disability. I'm going to give this to you, but just noting that 1 in 4 people in this room have some type of disability, whether visible or non-apparent, and that amount is actually growing due to long COVID and aging, and we've seen about 10% increase since the pandemic had started. So I'd love to hear from you. Yep, from that beginning to the end of the second little thingy.
Yeah. And I think in addition to that 1 in 4 here in the US, that number is over 1 billion globally, right? And I share that because I refuse to believe that over 1 billion of us are broken or bad or needs to be fixed or something's wrong with us, right? It's such a core part of the human experience for 1 billion of us. Okay. I will read the highlighted part. This is from a chapter called Why You Should Care About Disability. Back when I was at Georgetown in 2009, I applied for the Reimagine Georgetown grant to help fund the first student-run disability club at the university. As part of the application, I went through an interview with a selection committee of my peers. I will never forget the moment when one of the members of the committee looked at me and said, "How are you going to get people to care about disabled people?" I felt devalued, dehumanized, and discarded. Memories from my adolescence came rushing back, memories of feeling erased, insignificant, and invisible. The sad thing is that disabled people are no strangers to these emotions whenever we encounter resistance or are denied our basic human rights or equitable participation in daily activities. At that moment in the interview room, I told myself that I didn't want anyone else to feel like that. I told the committee that because I cared, I knew other people would care too. Despite that offensive question, we did receive the grant. I threw myself into the creation of Diversability. Our goal from the beginning was to create not a support group, but rather a disability pride movement. But people approached me confused. What's disability pride, they asked. How can you be proud to be disabled? As Ardra Shepard writes on her blog, Tripping on Air, being proud to be disabled isn't about liking my disability. It isn't about pretending that disability doesn't straight up suck. Rather, claiming disability pride is a rejection of the notion that I should feel ashamed of my body or my disability. Declaring my pride means that I don't accept society's definition of disability. Loving my disabled body is a radical act that can challenge the way people think about disability, one that promotes the idea that it's normal to be imperfect. I agree with Shepard. Disability pride doesn't mean loving every aspect of our disability, body, mind, or experience. It is nuanced and varied and means something different to each of us, but it means we get to be part of a vibrant community that we can be proud of.
Great, thank you. That's an excellent excerpt. I would love to hear from you now how you think people can be anti-ableist.
Ooh. So the definition of ableism that I use is when we devalue someone based on the way their body and or mind works. So I'm going to repeat that again. Are you a journalist here in the front? No? Just taking some notes. So ableism is when we devalue someone based on the way their body and or mind works. And so anti-ableism is what actions can we take maybe on a moment-by-moment basis so that we're not devaluing people. And I would encourage people to kind of reflect on, are there certain areas of my own life where I feel like I do devalue someone? And some examples of where intersectionality kind of comes into play is the way people devalue women's bodies, or the way we have devalued bodies based on their race. Or the way we question someone's intellect based on their gender, or the way they speak, or the pitch of their voice. But in terms of how we can be anti-ableist, can I have you hold this up?
I'm going to be Vanna.
So Vanna White is holding a postcard that says the Anti-Ableist Manifesto in large block letters at the top. And it has a series of statements, probably almost 30 statements on there, that say things like, disability is not a bad word, disability is intersectional, don't erase history. And part of why I wanted to show you this piece of art, and I also brought some extra postcards if you would like this art, is that I would always get the question, what's the one thing you want people to do to show up better for the disability community? And depending on who you are, that answer is different. If you're a social media content creator, maybe it's to make your social media content more accessible. If you are a venture capitalist, it is to invest in disabled entrepreneurs. If you are a hiring manager or in a position to hire, it's hiring disabled people. And so I share this because every statement on here corresponds with a chapter in the book. And I also share this because this is the art that is introduced in the conclusion of the book that you hang up in your office or your home. And if people ask you, how can I show up better to the disability community, for the disability community, you show them this art and you say, what statement or statements on here resonate with you? And that's going to be your introduction into this work.
Great. Well, you actually gave me a really good headway into a question that I have about intersectionality. How do we utilize the term intersectionality, which was coined by Dr. Kimberly Crenshaw, to reach across the aisle and build bridges in the movement towards collective liberation? Can you talk about some examples of that in your book?
So intersectionality, for people who are not aware, is essentially when different aspects of our identity, such as our gender or our race, our socioeconomic status, our body size, our disability status, all intersect to create this unique and compounded experience of oppression. And I have a chapter in the book where I talk about disability intersectionality. And there are kind of two ways that I talk about intersectionality. One is the ways in which, and actually when you sent me this question, I actually thought back to you, the ways in which any social justice movement is also a disability justice issue. And I think this is a great opportunity for you to talk about some of the work that you did around the Women's March, around after the 2016 election. And yeah, why don't you talk about that?
Oh gosh. Yeah, so I got involved in the Women's March partially on accident. I feel like a lot of times the way we get into movement spaces is kind of on accident, but sort of, a part of who we are. But, I was frustrated after the election, and I was looking for something to do with that frustration. I have a significant amount of anxiety. And so the way that I deal with my anxiety is put myself deeper into my work. And I am sure that's not healthy. And my therapist would tell me not to do that. But that is how I do it. And, I decided that I had been to a lot of movement spaces and felt unwelcomed in those spaces. And I was thinking, how do I utilize my knowledge and expertise to try to improve things? And so, I had originally thought I was just going to volunteer on the state level, but then I was like, well, a lot of people are asking about accommodations for this event, so let me see what I can do. And the deeper that I got into the event, the more I realized how left out the disability community was, particularly for disabled women, and how often our movement doesn't talk about women's issues and how disability can impact being a woman and being somebody that is not, straight cis male. And so, I saw the platform come out, and I immediately sent an email saying, this platform does not include disabled people. You need to rewrite it. And basically they looked at me and they're like, you're going to rewrite it. So that's what I had to do. I rewrote the whole platform to be more inclusive of disabled people, and spent the next couple years doing that. And that kind of led me into the work that I do now, which is policy and advocacy.
Can we clap? Can we clap for that? So that was one way disability intersectionality kind of manifests in one way, which is let's look at other social justice issues and ask ourselves, like, are they accessible? Are they thinking about the ways that disability intersects with these issues as well? And then the other way was kind of within our own identities. When Mia opened, she shared there aren't that many of us who are disabled and have disabilities who are doing the work. We all know each other, all 5 of us. And
the Asian Americans.
Sorry, the disabled Asian Americans. What did I say?
You just didn't have that category.
So I became really curious, and I included some of this research in the book. But in my parents' generation, Asian immigrants, mental illness is not considered a disability. I was diagnosed with PTSD in 2019, and the car accident was in 1997. So that's 22 years of what I would call both a diagnosis gap and a treatment gap. Because if I just looked on paper at a 9-year-old girl being in a car accident with someone passing away, I did not even label that as trauma until 2016. It was not part of my vocabulary. And part of that is cultural. So something that I've had to reckon with, and actually Mia, Mia's also featured in the book, was I heard Mia talk on a panel around this intersection of being disabled and being Asian. And she talked about how because we're disabled, we can't be the model minority, even though it's a myth. And when I heard her say that, it made me realize, wow, I had worked so hard so that my mom could see me as this like my mom, so that my mom could like brag about me, but nothing was ever enough. And now I understand that because in this disabled body, at least through her ableist lens, and she did come to one of my book events, so hopefully she will begin her unlearning journey. But through her lens, I would always be broken, even though on paper, literally so too many accolades. And it made me realize, like, in some ways, my Asian cultural background discriminates against my gender as a woman and discriminates against my disability status in that we should be hidden away. And I'm the youngest of four, so I have two brothers. It's two boys and two girls, and I see a difference in the way that my brothers are treated and I'm treated as well. So we have the identity part of intersectionality, and then we have the intersectionality of where it coincides with other social justice movements.
Yeah, I think it's interesting that you talk about the ways that Asian American communities sort of see disability, and I've always been very suspect of the percentage that they put out on Asian Americans and disability, because my belief is that a lot of Asian Americans don't identify as disabled, even if they have a disability. And I believe that many probably have some type of mental health disability. The problem has been that a lot of times we put disability in a white framework, and we're not very good at figuring out how to relate it to other cultures. And you see that not only in Asian American cultures, but you see this in Black communities, you see them in Hispanic, Latino communities. And the problem is that a lot of the treatment for that misses us because and the diagnosis is miss us because it's not in our general cultural framework to understand it in this sort of white Western sort of philosophy, and believing that sort of disability is directly connected to your work output, right? So I think that that's very interesting to think about, sort of the fact that we will never be the model minority, quote unquote, but then also pushing back and saying there is no such thing as a model minority as well, in general, and to emphasize that we are we are part of the community, and that is why we have such different backgrounds, and that's okay.
Yeah. And in some ways, I feel like it's changing with our generation. Like, I'm seeing a lot more people in our generation, because when something is so highly stigmatized, it makes it hard for people to get the support that they need. And so in some ways, I shared this quote on social media, but I can't remember. But it was essentially just saying we're breaking that intergenerational. We're ending it here. Yeah. And yeah, I feel hopeful.
Good.
That's all.
I'm glad to hear that you're feeling hopeful. I was wondering, not to bring you down a peg, but with attacks on DEI, how do you feel this type of work will be impacted, and how do you think we should push back?
There is a quote that I love from someone named Dr. Robert Bullard, and he is he's pretty well known in the environmental justice space. And he says, "The fight for justice is a marathon relay." And since our first iteration of Diversability is turning 15, and so if I look back, I've been disabled for almost 30 years. Yeah, we can clap for that. Diversability turning 15. So I've been disabled for almost 30 years, and I've been doing this work for 15. And part of why I bring that up is because when I heard Dr. Bullard say that quote, "The fight for justice is a marathon relay," what he made me realize is that we're never going to stop fighting. It's just going to look different from generation to generation. So with this quote unquote attack on DEI, I think we're still going to be fighting for justice. It might just look different it might just be under the guise of, it might be just be called something different, but we're still going to be fighting. And so I bring that up because, well, first of all, a marathon relay is tiring. Whew. Our sustainability is very much rooted in rest, but at the same time, I have to believe that there will be a certain time where I pass the baton on to the next generation. And because I've been active in this space for 15 years, I have seen change. In 2009, I would tell people, I would say disability pride, and I would get the strangest looks, like they couldn't even comprehend how a disabled person could be proud. And now in 2024, we're seeing, California State proclaimed July as Disability Pride Month. We're seeing our community get a lot more visibility and a lot more representation that we hadn't seen in the past. So I'm grateful that I've stayed in this long enough to be able to see that some things are changing. So I've always been one to, or not always, I just think about how it can be so easy to get stuck in the doom and gloom. And yes, let's make space for that, right? Feel whatever you need to feel. And at the same time, I don't know if staying there is going to lead to the action that we want. Like, I actually think it can be so consuming that you end up not taking any action at all.
Very true. Very true. Last question. All right. If there is one thing readers should carry with them after finishing the Anti-Ableist Manifesto, what would that be?
I'm going to share two things that I read from the reviews of the book. And one was that they thought this book felt like a must-read for humanity type of book. It's so silent, and then I hear affirmations. And then the other was that it left a reader feeling energized and hopeful that creating a disability-inclusive society is possible. And I bring that up because ableism to me is like an octopus that has unlimited tentacles. It infiltrates every single part of our lives. And if we feel so guilty and feel so much shame that we have contributed to this ableist system, then we're not going to take any action. So the book is actually structured in a framework called Me, We, Us, which is a social impact framework that I learned a couple of years ago about how we can create transformative change. So here are the things I need to know about disability and ableism. Here are the things that we need to know in community with each other. And then here are the things that if we want to take it to the next level, things that the type of work that Mia is doing on a more systemic level, policy change. But we can't just jump straight into chapter 34 because we've also had a law in place for over 30 years called the Americans with Disabilities Act that is supposed to protect our rights in public spaces and employment. But part of why I don't think it has been enforced and executed in the way that many and all the dreams of it fulfilled is because it started out because people still don't believe that we are valuable human beings, which is to me like part one. So part three is let's put the policies and the structures in place. But if you put policies and structures in place and you still do not believe that disabled people are your peers and your colleagues and your managers and part of the bookstore staff and attendees here, then you're not going to actually implement those policies and they'll end up becoming performative and just be there to be there.
Great. Thank you so much. I believe we have 10 minutes for questions. So if you want to line up, feel free to ask questions. And first...
Thank you so much to both of you for being here today. You both are amazing and transformative individuals. My name is Nathan Weisler, and I'm a recent college graduate from the Washington, D.C. area. Drawing on my own experiences on the autism spectrum, for about 15 years I've done writing and public speaking to help encourage anti-ableism and true inclusion and acceptance. I have also formed strong opinions on the topics of ableism and anti-ableism, largely based on my own life experiences and interactions that I have had over the years. In that context, I particularly appreciated what you wrote about your experience of riding a bicycle in Amsterdam and the subsequent reactions that you got from different people about riding a bicycle. And I'm seriously considering helping to work to contribute to fostering anti-ableism and acceptance and inclusion in the field of education. I'm considering working as an educator to help work on those goals. And I was wondering, two things. Would you be able to speak some about your experience in Amsterdam? And also, what do you believe are some of the most significant and substantial ways in which educators, both today and in future generations, can help to encourage anti-ableism and can help to build a better world?
Such a good question. Thank you. I'll answer the second one first, which is so after my accident, in my 30s, I learned that I could have been eligible for something called an IEP, which, if you work in the education space, I believe it stands for Individualized Education Plan. And part of why I bring that up is because I had to relearn how to write with my non-dominant hand. But I don't have an IEP. And I think part of that is my mom was not aware of what resources were available. And also, potentially, it may have been a different time 25 years ago, and she saw accommodations as quote unquote special treatment, which they're not. So I wanted to bring that up first, which is how can we kind of reframe that accommodations are there not as special treatment, but to promote equity. And this didn't make it into the book, but my latest aha is that the definition of inclusive design is how can we create multiple design variations to have the desired outcome, the same desired outcome. In some ways, accommodations are a version of inclusive design because multiple design variations, so different ways that you take the test, the desired outcome is you take the test, right? And so I think just having more conversations around that. And then one of the things I've also realized too is I'm now talking to a lot of parents of disabled kids, and they will be advocating for their kids to go on the field trip or go on these different activities. And the educators are not aware how to create access for them. And part of it is that the disabled student opts out, right? Similar to what happened at mealtime. And so my hope is that as we start to show up more, it won't be such an unknown thing about how to make access for someone. And hey, we can co-create access together. I don't know if you had any thoughts on advice for educators. I also think that you being a leader, being an educator, is going to be a possibility model for all the students and so many other people who never thought that pursuing a career in education was for them.
Well, first, I want to say congratulations on graduating. Major props. I think that I think you actually mentioned this in the book, which is that I believe that we need to design for the most vulnerable, right? And that helps to ensure that everybody has access to things. And so when I think about education, so oftentimes we kind of package it into one big sort of structure that isn't able to fully accommodate every student, and that has consequences, particularly for children who are of racial minorities or cultural minorities, disabled students, students who are from low-income backgrounds. And that has led to this stratification in education because we have this belief that we can just package it all into one. And so thinking about like IEPs, these things should be provided to every student rather than requiring parents who often don't have like a handbook out there on like, here's how to deal with like structural ableism, except for, I mean, this is out now out there. But you know, we generally don't have a handbook of to-dos on how to get services for our kids. So why don't we provide these services to every single kid? And that way we are designing for the most marginalized communities and ensuring that everybody has access to the resources available.
And to answer very briefly on the Amsterdam, if you read the book or you watched any of my talks, one of my least favorite memories growing up was this mandatory physical education class that I had to take. And they made no accommodations or adjustments for me to participate, so I opted out. Actually, I couldn't opt out. I just sat on the side. And so I think one of the things I'm reflecting on with this, so I learned how to code in Amsterdam, and I also relearned how to ride a bike there. But sometimes we spend more time having to make people who question our abilities or our capabilities, making them comfortable than trying to just do the thing. And that's kind of what came up for me when I was in Amsterdam and was attempting to bike, and now I've done a triathlon. And so it's just like, and I think with the visibility of the Paralympic movement and other things like that, being able to see, again, more possibility models of people who have all different types of disabilities doing all in education in Amsterdam, riding bikes, will stop making all of those things so sensationalized. Thank you. Oh, go.
Actually, we have a question over here, if you don't mind.
Hi. What would you say to someone who either newly has a disability or whose disability has worsened? I ask because mine has worsened and it doesn't fit with my image of myself anymore. And this seems like something that maybe you can relate to as well. Thanks.
I call this disability grief. And for those of us who acquire our disabilities or they become more debilitating over time, you will experience grief. I hope it's a grief we spend more time talking about. The last two stages of grief are meaning and acceptance. It took me over 10 years to even start that journey of my own disability grief journey. And it may not land for you right now for me to say, hey, you'll find some meaning and acceptance in this, because I want you to make space for the fact that it's really hard. And I want to share that for many of us who have acquired spinal cord injuries, we have something called a life day, which mine is November 29th. It's the day when our new life began. And I actually spoke with another disabled person who calls her life day her death day, because that's the day she needed to let go of who she used to be so that she could embrace who she's becoming now. So we can talk afterward. And I think that is also part of why I do share my disability origin story, because for those of us who acquire our disabilities, we remember what it was like, to not have that disability, or to have our bodies and our minds operate or work in a different way. And yeah, I think just making space, maybe that's the next book, is on disability grief. But I think Brené Brown said that grief is the #1 emotion that we're most terrified to experience. And most of us think of grief in terms of losing a loved one, but I also think of grief in terms of changes in our body. I think of grief in terms of childhood trauma, like the loss of childhood innocence. My friend is writing a book right now on friendship breakups. Like romantic breakups are a type of grief too, right? So I think just broadening our definition of what grief looks like hopefully will create a little bit more compassion and empathy so that we can express the things that we're feeling. We can grieve. And I guess I'll put one asterisk in there as well and say, it's totally fine if no one no one understands what you're going through. And I hope that you have people in your life and community who will make space for that, even if they don't fully understand.
Oh, hey, Tiffany. Hey, Mia. First off, congratulations on this book. And writing a book is just in and of itself accomplishment. So hats off to you, because I know it's torture. Second of all,
It's true.
yeah. I'm worried. A lot of the book talks about intersectionality. You talk about Asian culture and your own culture. I think about this as a Latino person and as a disabled person. I think one of the things, and Mia, you talked about this, and this is so great that you say that like a lot of our archetypes and our kind of blueprints for disability and ableism, conversely, are rooted in, they were designed with white male children in mind. And at the same time, when you're talking about it and you're introducing concepts of disability, I see this in my own with Latinos, and I know a lot of people do this with Black Americans, with Asian Americans. How do you introduce these concepts without coming off like a smarty pants and condescending to these cultures and almost saying like your culture is bad for like because of the way that it has disability, but like rather helping to accept it without like coming off as like coming from on high, but actually as part of your culture and community?
Ooh, that's such a good question. And by the way, Eric wrote a book called We're Not Broken. Check it out. May or may not be available at Politics and Prose.
Do check it out.
And the Heels are playing tonight at 11:30.
Yes. Go Heels.
I don't know if this is the answer, but I've been really guided by something that I saw on social media that said learning should never be about shame. And I don't want to shame. That's why I always like, even in the context of this conversation, I'm like, Mia, what do you think? And we have so many other experts here too, who I hope you get a chance to meet. But I come back to wanting to understand where the other person is coming from. I don't feel any anger toward my cultural background or my cultural upbringing. I have a lot of compassion for the cards that my mom was dealt, and I don't want to be her in a lot of ways because it was really hard. But how can I don't know. I think it's something I'm still learning. How can we have compassion or how can we take the time to understand where people are coming from? And I'll just share a very brief thing, which is when I was a freshman in college, I went to a university that has a lot of international students, and I met a student who grew up in mainland China, and he said to me, Taiwan is a province of China. And that is not what I grew up with. And I bring that up. And actually, I did not realize it was such a political thing until the Olympics and the Paralympics, because I grew up knowing something different. And what I realized was there is no way I'm going to convince him of something he has spent 18 years believing, right? And how can we coexist in this space together? I guess we call this the status quo, but we don't need to get too political about that. But I do think about that, where it's like, wow, this person grew up believing this for such a long period of time. Yeah. And this is why I really like connecting with people either on social media or on LinkedIn after I meet them, because over a period of time, not only do they get to see kind of the content that I'm putting out, I have friends I've known for 15 years who now start sharing about their vision disorder or the time they were hospitalized for their mental illness, because they're starting to have more examples of different narratives that they can incorporate into their learning.
Cool. Thank you so much.
And this is the first time Eric and I are meeting, and he endorsed the book, and he's also featured in the book. So I hope you get to meet him, and maybe for his next book. Oh yeah, he just pointed. Maybe he'll be at Politics and Prose again.
You bet. I love these folks. They'll let me back. Yeah.
I think I wanted to add one more thing, and I think it's Because I come from an organizing background and I've done quite a bit of canvassing in Asian American communities, having conversations, having tough conversations about how we view the world, how we talk about the world. And one of the things that I learned in the work that I do is how to culturally translate your ideas. And so thinking about, and I do this in the South too, you know, being in being from North Carolina, is thinking about how does this person frame the world? How do they see the world shaped as? And how do I get to where they are and start where they are to have a conversation about the things that are bothering them, the things that matter to them in their life? And that helps to sort of reduce some of the friction in our conversations, where I'm like, okay, we both have this understanding of X. Let's have a conversation about that and where you're coming from so that I can think about how I am portraying my ideas to you. And that has been sort of the basic framework that I work in to organize on in any community is, you know, learning when to be quiet and learning when to speak up and being able to translate things into ways that can be understood in other cultures.
Hello. This question can sort of be for both of you, but as disabled advocates, what do you believe is the best way for the history of how disabled people have been viewed and treated, both here in the US and internationally, should be educated and talked about? Because as both as a disabled person and a history major, I believe history is the key to, one, understanding, two, learning and change. So, how do you believe that it should be talked about and educated like other forms of mistreatment and malpractice and whatnot?
Yeah, so I love history and got really into the topic in high school because I had a really cool professor. And one of the things that I kind of realized was that history is often taught in the framework of the winners, right? And so, you know, uh, the thing that I think about often is how do we talk about the people who have been oppressed, the people who have been attacked, and go from that framework. And I believe I'm going to totally frack up this book title, but I think it's uh, United States history.
A disability history of the United States?
No. It's the general U.S. history.
People's history?
People's history, thank you. That actually literally flips it on its head, people's history, and it talks about from the framework of indigenous people, of Black Americans who were, you know, fighting for civil rights. It talked about framework from women's perspectives. I think that's really important to include and to think about when we're talking about disability history. Whose history are we talking about? Are we talking just about the white perspective, the white cis hetero perspective, or are we talking about some of the most marginalized in our communities who are part of so many other parts of history, whether it's part of the Black Panthers movement, part of the women's movement, etc. We have been a part of every single historical moment. And I think we need to understand that we shouldn't be talking about disability in a single siloed framework, that we need to understand it in the context of the general history of the United States and of the world.
I guess I'll add to say, you know, reflecting on who is telling our stories, you know, and then also thinking about the different mediums too, right? I know Crip Camp was, it's a documentary. You can watch it for free on YouTube, I believe still, but also the ways that disability is erased from historical figures and just erased in general, right? That's another way that ableism kind of shows up. So I'm super excited about kind of the trajectory that you're going on, so you can ensure that our stories are in there. And one of my friends just got a book deal to write about disability history in the UK. And I know I come at this book from a very US perspective, and I'm excited to see how we can materialize disability history all over the world too.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Can we do these last two questions and then we can sign some books? And if you would like a book, you can purchase them, I believe, in the back corner over there. There's next to a big sign with my photo on it.
Hello. Thank you so much for being here, and I was so excited to have made it. I am a disabled Asian American doing disability work, so I'm part of the club. Me and I have worked
The
together.
exclusive club.
Very exclusive. We should welcome more people in.
Yes.
I actually came into the space as a parent of a disabled child, even though I was diagnosed with a disability when I was a teenager. I didn't identify as disabled through a combination of not having the language for it and the stigma that you spoke about, specifically the cultural stigma. So my question is, well, I'm going to tell you the question I'm not going to ask you, and then I'm going to ask you the question I want to ask you. The question I'm not going to ask you is, what would you say to parents of disabled children? Because I have asked that question to everyone I know. I would like to know, what do you say to parents of non-disabled children or not yet disabled children? Because the conversation that we just had about allyship made me think about what we're teaching our children so that they know how to be anti-ableist, rather than grow up and then having to go through this process of unlearning and then learning. So I'm curious to hear your thoughts.
You had a really good excerpt in there, so I'm going to hand it to you.
I did. So there's someone I had in the book. Her name's Kelly Coleman. She wrote a book called Everything No One Tells You About Parenting a Disabled Child. But I will let you buy the book and read the excerpt on your own time. But what came up for me is I actually saw a piece of social media content around how to engage with kids and their curiosity, non-disabled kids and their curiosity around disability. And the first thing that the person who's being interviewed said was to affirm your child's curiosity. So if the child goes, "Oh, look, it's a wheelchair," you go, "Yes, that's a wheelchair." And then see where the conversation kind of goes from there. I feel like curiosity around a service animal. Like, "Oh, there's a dog." Like, "Yes, that's the dog. It's a service animal." Like, and then go from there. But do you have any?
Yeah, just don't shush up your kid on it, I think, which you state in your book, because it teaches them that you're not supposed to talk about disability.
Thank you. And I think we follow each other on former...
I definitely follow you everywhere.
Oh.
That's not creepy.
Thanks, Mia.
No
And
problem.
with that, okay, last question.
Hi. Mia, would you and Tiffany care to comment on the future of disabilities research?
Ooh. Well, I have an answer that's not an answer, and then I'll turn it over to Mia, which is I recently got appointed to the NIH National Advisory Board for Medical Rehabilitation Research. Thank you. We have our first meeting on December 2nd, though, so I'm not quite sure, but I do think it is part of their, I don't know if that was kind of in the scope of your question, but I looked at who is on the advisory board, and it's a combination of people who have lived experience, which is great, a lot of professors and doctors, and yeah, I'm curious. I'll be serving in that until 2028, but I hope that we can help inform where some of the research priorities and funding go toward.
As a researcher, yeah, I think that one of the things that science has a tendency to do is believe that we can only know something based on numbers, based on quantitative facts, right? And that they are non-biased in nature. And I think with some of the work that has been done by amazing, sociologists, um, uh, is to realize that there's bias in everything. And there's bias in the work that we do as researchers. And I think that people are coming to realize that we need to hear more from the voices of the people that we are, quote unquote, doing research on, right? And I think for me in particular, I really try and focus on a mixed methodology of using qualitative and quantitative analysis to be able to not only have the numbers to back up what I'm talking about, but also the real life stories of people who are living that life. And I think it's it's something that I'm seeing more often in research, and I think that we need to continue to push that as a way to better understand. I think a lot of times, particularly disabled people, but other marginalized communities, we aren't seen as experts of the lives that we live. Right? We're told like, oh, we're kind of like, oh, you're a good kid, like, but you can't sit with the grown-ups at the table with the PhDs and MDs, etc. And I think that people are coming to realize that you can do research on your own communities. You can help uplift voices from that community and really start from where the community is, rather than starting from this elitist sort of white rich mentality of what should be researched. And I'm really hopeful that we can continue to get more representation in research positions, in policy, in science, in order to ensure that these voices are heard in the work that we do.
Thank you both.
Can we do one group photo? And this is my friend Nick. Can you do it? Maybe can you stand over here and then we'll look back? I don't know. What's the best way to do a non-awkward group photo?
We can turn. I just won't fall off this stage. We'll be good. Sit. Good.
Can I hold your book?
Yes. With all the
stickies.
Stickies.
Wait, can you see people?
Yes, I can see them. All right, and I'm gonna take a few. iPhone. All right, and it's great.
Yay! Thank you all so much for coming out. Thank you so much for coming out. Again, you can watch me drop that and get a signed